So for your last piece of work, we looked at voluntary manslaughter, which included diminished responsibility and loss of control. For this piece of work, we are going to be looking at involuntary manslaughter. So, as with voluntary manslaughter, an illegal killing has to have taken place. However, D does not have to have the intention to kill or cause GBH. The maximum sentence for involuntary manslaughter is life imprisonment. But as with voluntary manslaughter, the judge has discretion in this. Therefore, it's important for the defendant because they might not have to go to prison or go to prison for life as they would with a normal murder conviction. So for your work, we'll be looking at unlawful act manslaughter and gross negligence manslaughter. So remember then, use the books. Now we've started using our books, the textbooks a little bit more, our work has improved. So explain all the points, remember to use capital letters, proofread your own work so that you're not having to carry on printing and resubmitting your work to me just for a few spelling mistakes. If you make sure that you get those right first time, that'll reduce the amount of submissions that you have to do and also the amount of marking that I have to do. Remember to, when you use cases, to link to the point of law that you're discussing. We are getting better at this as a class. So your task then. Introduction to unlawful act manslaughter and its 4 elements, plus any other introductory information on the offence. Then you have to go through and answer the different points. So this is what's on your help sheet. So the elements of unlawful manslaughter are: the defendant must do an unlawful act. The act must be dangerous on an objective test. The act must cause the death, and the defendant must have the required mens rea for the unlawful act. So, point 1 then. For each of the points on the page before, I'm then going to go through and discuss them in a bit more detail. So, point 1. So, death must be caused by an unlawful act, which must be a criminal offence. So, in Franklin, 1883, D threw a box into the sea, which hit and killed a swimmer. It was held that a civil wrong was not enough to create liability for unlawful act manslaughter. In many cases, the unlawful act will be some kind of assault. So from Franklin then, it was held that it has to be a criminal act. That's the unlawful act and not a civil one. So Lamb then, 1967. In this case, it was discussed that the unlawful act must be criminal. I don't know why it says there, that the unlawful act must be criminal. Lamb and his friend were fooling around with a revolver. They knew it was loaded, but they didn't think it would fire. Neither of them did. So Lamb pointed the gun at his friend and pulled the trigger. It killed him. It was held that the defendant was not guilty as he didn't have the mens rea, as there were no assault. So if you remember when you looked at assault last year, you have to fear some kind of violence. His friend didn't fear anything because neither of them thought that the gun would fire. Therefore, there wasn't a criminal act there. So there must be an act, not an omission, for an unlawful act manslaughter. So this was said in Lau and Khan. So in Khan and Khan, the defendant supplied a prostitute with heroin. She injected herself and died. The Court of Appeal quashed the conviction as they had not done an unlawful act. They had admitted to get help for her when she was in a coma, but that omission was not an act for the purposes of unlawful act manslaughter. So point 2 then, dangerous. The unlawful act must be dangerous on an objective test. In church, it was held that it must be such as all sober and reasonable people would inevitably recognise, must subject the other person to, at least, the risk of some harm resulting therefrom, albeit not serious harm. Therefore then, the risk need only be of some harm, not serious. If a sober and reasonable person realises that the unlawful act might cause some injury, then this part is satisfied. It does not matter that D did not realise there was any risk of harm to another person. So in the case of Larkin, 1943, this illustrates both the need of an unlawful act and for there to be, on an objective viewpoint, the risk of some harm. So D threatened a man with a razor. His mistress tried to intervene, but drunk, she fell into the razor, cut herself and died. The act of threatening the other man was technical assault. It was also an act that was dangerous because it was likely to injure someone. So it was held where the act which a person is engaged in performing is unlawful, then if at the same time it's a dangerous act, that is, an act which is likely to injure another person, and quite inadvertently he causes the death of that person by the act, then he is guilty of manslaughter. You can read these in the textbooks. So you must then do this for the rest of the cases that your help sheet asks you to discuss. So remember to state what was held in terms of the point of law you're discussing. What does dangerous mean? I advise reading the book first and then beginning to write your answer. So point 3 then, causing the death. So the unlawful act must cause the death. The rules of causation are the same as for murder. Therefore, if the chain of causation is broken, then D cannot be liable for manslaughter. This has caused problems where D has supplied V with an illegal drug. If D injects V, then there is no break in the chain. This was shown in Cato. D and V injected each other with heroin. V died. By injecting V with heroin, D had committed the unlawful act of administering a noxious substance to V. As V died, Cato was convicted for unlawful act manslaughter. Now do the same for the rest of the cases, discussing whether D caused the death and if there was an intervening act that broke the chain of causation. Point 4. Mens rea. So D must have the required mens rea for the unlawful act. It's not necessary for D to realise that the act is unlawful or dangerous. So if you read pages 49 to 50 in the book that I showed you online resources, go to A2 Law and scroll down to the blue book that's got the fingerprint on it. I'll show you this again in class so you can explain this section fully. Remember to use the books. If you read through the chapters that have got the same headings as the question that you're answering, it will tell you why the law is applied to the point that you're trying to make. It's a lot easier than Googling the cases and trying to figure it out for yourself. The books really help you with this piece of work. So the next part that we will be looking at then is gross negligence manslaughter. So this is a separate piece of work to unlawful act, and you've got different deadlines for it. So gross negligence manslaughter is completely different to unlawful act manslaughter. It's where D owes V a duty of care but breaches that duty in a very negligent way, causing the victim to die. It can be an act or an omission, which does not have to be unlawful. So the leading case on gross negligence manslaughter is Adamarco, 1994. So in this case, D was an anaesthetist for V during an operation. That is, the person that puts you to sleep during surgery. So during the surgery, the tubes became disconnected, and the defendant didn't notice that V had died. The evidence that was suggested in court said that D should have noticed this within 15 seconds. Therefore, D was charged with gross negligence manslaughter, and this was upheld by the House of Lords. From Adamarco, it appears that the elements of gross negligence manslaughter are the existence of a duty of care towards V, a breach of that duty of care which causes the death, gross negligence which the jury considers to be criminal, and that the gross negligence was a substantial cause of the death of the victim. So point 1 then, what is a duty of care? In each case you're given, you must say what was said about a duty of care. For example, in Adamarco it was held that a doctor had a duty of care towards his patient. Answer the remaining questions on the help sheet. Use a textbook and ensure that you read the chapter relating to the point that you're answering. For example, Adamarco is discussed in each section. Therefore, you must read the case in each section as they cover different aspects of the case, depending on which point of the law they are discussing. I'm not going to go through any more points with you as it's all in the textbook and you should have successfully already done this correctly for gross negligence manslaughter. So the first part. For this part, I'm not going to go through it all. I've gone through point 1 with you and I want you to read the help sheet, use the textbook, go through this, apply the law and make sure that you're actually telling me which part of the law you're applying it to and what point of law arose from that case. Remember to check your spellings as usual, put your work through Turnitin and hand it in to me on the deadline day. Thank you.